It's kind of a miracle that I'm here because I was in Washington, D.C. a couple of days ago, and my publisher said, why don't you try to outrun the storm by heading north to New York? And I thought, I don't think so. So I drove south instead, and I went to Richmond and got the plane out of there. I live in Busan, which is a harbor town on the south coast of South Korea, and I never see snow there, and I was really looking forward to seeing it this time, but I don't care if I never see any snow again at this stage. Okay, what can you hear about North Korea that you haven't heard 1,000 times before? Really only the most important thing, which is what do the North Koreans think and how do they see themselves in the world around them? I'd like to start with an analogy. Let's imagine that the house next door to where you live has been empty for some time, and finally somebody has come to move into it, and you look out your window and you see them unloading assault weapons, I don't know, grenade launchers as well, bazookas, you name it. Now, this is America, so it's probably all perfectly legal. But as you lie awake at night, having put your house on the market, you're probably asking yourself certain things, and I don't think you're asking yourself what kind of cognac that man drinks, or who's going to inherit the house after he dies. And I don't think you're all that interested in how many calories his kids are getting every day. You're probably more interested in what he thinks, how he sees himself, what he's teaching his kids. And this is why I find it so baffling that in the United States, although we fought one war with the North Koreans, losing 54,000 people in the process, and although we came very close to fighting another war in 1993 and 1994, and although we've been locked in this increasingly dangerous nuclear standoff with the North Koreans, we still are not interested in what ideology they have and why they're doing all this. And in the meantime, we're sort of compulsively accumulating hard facts. And then we wonder why we still don't understand this country. It's almost as if we didn't know that Iran was an Islamic country. It really wouldn't matter how much intelligence we were able to gather about Iran. Its behavior would still baffle us. And this is the problem that we have in North Korea. And this is why today I'd like to talk to you about North Korean ideology. I realize that sounds like a kind of dull topic. So I've chosen the parts of my book that I think lend themselves more to a visual presentation like this. There is some heavier stuff in the book as well. But I thought I'd keep it out of the talk today. Ideology is especially important because this regime and this man that you see here in this picture enjoy a much higher degree of mass support than we tend to assume. We tend to think of North Korea as a country that's in a sort of permanent lockdown that survives purely by dint of its repressiveness alone. And that's just not the case. And I think the evidence for this lies in the North Korean border itself. Now, on the left, you have the East German border, which I remember very well. I was a student in West Germany, and I would go to Berlin quite often on the train, and we'd have to go through this border. And on the right, you have the North Korean border. And you can see they're very different. This is, of course, the border to China and not the DMZ to South Korea. But still, it's a very easy border to cross. And a very interesting statistic is that 50% of those who do cross this border into China bribe their way back into the country. Now, nobody tried to bribe their way back into the Soviet Union or back into East Germany. So I would warn you against taking the hyperbole of a lot of these North Korean refugee NGOs seriously. They like to talk about the Underground Railroad that is helping North Korean migrants to safety. Well, I don't know of any slaves bribing their way back onto the plantation. So we need to realize that this is a country that survives not by dint of repressiveness alone, but because it is able to inspire its people still. So that's what I want to talk to you today about, is how does it inspire its people? I want to stay in the here and now, but we need to go back into history a little bit, and I want to talk about Juche, because Juche is actually not the main ideology in North Korea. Juche was a reaction to this man here, to the Chinese personality cult, which began exploding in the mid-1960s. The North Koreans felt the need to match this cult claim for claim. So Mao Zedong claimed that he was a poet, of course, and he enjoyed quite a good deal of international renown for his poetry. So the North Korean personality cult suddenly remembered plays which Kim Il-sung had allegedly written in his youth, of which no mention had been made until then. Mao Zedong had the Long March, for which he was very famous, on which he'd led his troops. And the North Korean historians suddenly remembered the Arduous March that Kim Il-sung had taken his troops on. Mao Zedong had Maoism as a world-famous ideology, and this claim, of course, forced the North Koreans to come up with something that they called Juche thought. Now, this is kind of a dry topic. I've written a lot of academic papers about it, but it doesn't really lend itself to a talk like this. But I just want to give you an example of what this sham doctrine looks like, because it is a sham doctrine. It exists to be praised and not to be read. It exists really only to enable the claim that Kim Il-sung is a great ideologue. This is just an excerpt from it, a representative excerpt, I might add. Now, I recognize this prose style because this is how I used to write in college when I had a term paper due the next day. And I had to fill 10 pages and at the same time make sure that the professor didn't actually read them. So I would just repeat things over and over again and make it as dull and stodgy as possible. And that's what you see in this so-called Juche thought. Now, the regime, when it actually has a message that it wants to put across, it can do this very well. These are the best propagandists in the world. This is the most ingenious propaganda apparatus in the world. And it knows that when it wants to get a message across, that's not the way to do it. This is the prose that they use to fill those book spines so that people can look at those book spines and say, our Kim Il-sung is just as great an ideologue as Mao Zedong was. But in North Korea, ideology is not so much learned from the leaders as learned about the leaders. In other words, what people are taught in so-called political study sessions are the fantasy biographies of the two Kims. It's not so much what the Kims said as what they did, in other words. Just one more interesting fact, the North Korean Encyclopedia entry on the Juche Tower is twice as long as the entry on Juche thought. And that really tells you all you need to know about Juche thought, which I don't really want to talk more about today. Okay, now to go back a little bit into history, do we have any Koreans here today? Any Koreans? Yeah? You guys Koreans? Yeah? Okay. Now, if you live in Korea, as I do, then you may well be a fan of these historical Korean TV dramas. And if you watch them, you will have people maybe 1,000 years ago talking about the Korean nation or the Korean race, the Minjok. And actually, the word Minjok did not appear in the Korean language until the Japanese brought it to the Korean people. And as Professor Carter Eckert of Harvard University has said, there was no strong sense of belonging to a Korean nation until very late in the 19th century. In other words, the Koreans were not nationalists. They were xenophobic, but there's a difference between xenophobia and nationalism. As you can see from this map, this is a Korean map from 1402. The Koreans at that time believed their country to be on the outskirts of this great Chinese cultural realm. They saw themselves in a sort of permanent student position to the great Chinese teacher. So, in 1910, of course, Korea was annexed. Here you see the Korean soldiers. And for the first few years of the Japanese occupation of Korea, the Japanese ruled their subjects so heavy-handedly that this nascent Korean nationalism bubbled over into a big demonstration in 1919, which frightened the Japanese. And after that, the Japanese relaxed some of the repressive policies that had inflamed the Koreans, and they decided to co-opt Korean nationalism instead of trying to stamp it out. And they did so in a very ingenious way. They did so with a campaign called Naisen Ittai in Japanese, or Nesan Ilche in Korean, which means Japan and Korea as one body. Now you see from that map on the left, Japan and Korea both painted the same color on the school map. The message that the Japanese spread in Korea was that you Koreans and we Japanese, we may have drifted apart over the millennia, but we are actually one people. We go back to the same divine progenitor Jimmu. We all have this uniquely pure racial bloodline, and this bloodline makes us uniquely pure, makes us also uniquely pure-hearted and morally superior to people in other races. So, this is another postcard. This is a postcard from the period. On the right you have Japan, and on the left you have Korea in a three-legged race around the world. The legend says, let's cooperate together. Now, is anybody here from Texas? You're from Texas. Great. Well, the reason I ask, I'm not losing my mind. The reason I ask is I used to live in New Mexico, and the Texans would come over in the summer to Ruidoso and places like that, and you'd see the bumper stickers would have the flag of Texas and the United States flag, and the slogan was, "Proud Texan, Proud American." And this is really the kind of attitude that the Japanese were aiming for in Korea. They wanted the Koreans to be proud of their Koreanness. They actually urged them to take pride in their history, in their culture, in their dialect. They didn't want to call it a language. But at the same time, they wanted them to be proud of belonging to this greater Yamato whole. And this idea actually went down much better than South Koreans today and North Koreans today would like to acknowledge.